we have our speaker this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce Brendan Bagnell, who is the founder and CEO of Awake a Nation and the developer of Align, the identity operating system, a gospel-centered coaching framework focused on identity formation and spirit-led leadership development. With over 15 years of experience in pastoral leadership, higher education, and personal coaching, he has taught at the college level and worked extensively with academic and ministry contexts. Brendan's work integrates biblical theology, leadership theory, and practical coaching tools to help leaders move from performance-driven identity to authentic, sustainable alignment rooted in the gospel. He holds a Master of Divinity and a Master of Arts in Christian Leadership. And just for Brendan, this group who's coming over, most of them are alumni of our programs. We have 3 flagship programs that we conduct as part of Christ University's Higher Education Leadership Institute. And they're for 3 different levels or roles of people in academia. One is the early career roles, then the mid-career roles, and then the senior administrators. So you have a few from each of these flagship programs of ours attending tonight or this morning for you. And also another program that we conduct is facilitation skills for leadership development. And so you have people from all of these streams joining in today. I want to especially thank all those people who've taken time to be with us. And I don't want to take a lot more of my time, but give the floor to Brendan Bagnell as he talks to us on the topic, the inner life of a leader, why personal transformation determines institutional impact. I want to let the people on the call know that Mr. Brendan is dialing in from the United States. It's early morning, 6:30 for him. Shouldn't have done at this time, but I did check with him if this was okay for him to do, and he said yes. And for many of you who actually do virtual programs, you know how difficult it is to do a session at 6:30 in the morning. But I want to personally thank Mr. Brendan for taking time and being with us tonight. And over to you to listen to you on the inner life of a leader.
Thank you, Mr. John, and thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to spend some time with you this evening for you, this morning for me. And I'm just looking forward to just a few minutes to just share my heart, share my experience, and hopefully provide you with some passion and a deeper passion for leadership and for those that you lead. So let me see. I'd like to share my screen. Let's see if that'll pop up there. All right. So, Mr. John, again, first of all, thank you for the invitation and your leadership there at the Institute and the opportunity to share just a few minutes with everybody. As a sort of a brief introduction to this particular topic, the inner life of a leader, I want to share a little bit of background of myself and how I came to this passion, this desire to really focus on the inner life of a leader. So my academic journey sort of began earning a Bachelor of Science degree in aviation. I was desiring to become a pilot after I finished my high school. Then things kind of took a different turn than I originally had planned, which is sort of how life works. And I ended up in a career in law enforcement, served as a police officer for almost 10 years. And of course, in that environment, leadership has quite a big, important role. And there are a lot of high stakes decisions that take place in law enforcement. So I learned a lot about myself, a lot about others, and a lot about leadership. Later on, I moved into pastoral leadership and organizational leadership roles, sort of navigating the complexity there of dealing with people, as far as issues, conflict, institutional culture, and then personal development and helping others succeed as well. Had the privilege of serving also as a college professor and executive leadership within higher education, working closely with faculty, administration, students in both academic and leadership development contexts. On the academic front, I do hold a Master of Arts in Christian Leadership and a Master of Divinity. My graduate work really focused on leadership theory, spiritual formation, and organizational development. I do also hold a Master Certified Professional Life Coach training through the International Coaching Federation. And really today, I specifically focus on leader formation and personal transformation. The interesting thing is across all these backgrounds and experiences, whether it was aviation, law enforcement, church leadership, higher education, I began to notice sort of some patterns and some things that stood out to me. Even though the leadership challenges were different in each of those environments, the institutional cultures were different in those environments. But I noticed that the internal struggle of the leader was often the same. And it was that realization that really has become the foundation of what I want to share with you tonight. And it's really become the foundation of my own passion when it comes to leadership. But before I jump into the context of what I want to share, I do want to kind of challenge you with a brief moment of reflection. So think about the most impactful leader that you've ever worked under. That may have been somebody in an academic setting, maybe a mentor, senior administrator, or somebody earlier in your career. So ask yourself this question: what did they carry internally that shaped the environment around them? Not what did they teach, not what was their strategic plan, or what policies did they implement, but what did they carry internally? Was it a confidence, so this calm confidence, maybe insecurity, intellectual humility? Was it pressure? Because whether we realize it or not, leaders transmit more than just information. And a lot of times institutions don't drift towards excellence. They drift towards the inner condition of a leader. And tonight, I want to explore a very simple but profound idea with you. The inner life of a leader determines the institutional impact of that leader. I want you to think about that for a minute. The inner life of a leader determines the institutional impact of that leader. So, as I mentioned, across my aviation studies, law enforcement, church leadership, and higher education, I began to notice a pattern. Even though the environments, the org charts, the pressures, all those things were different, something inside me and other leaders was consistent. In moments of growth, in seasons of conflict, and high pressure leadership decisions, there was often something operating beneath the surface, right here on the inside. And in that, I discovered there was a pressure in me to prove that I was competent. There was this desire to be respected. And most of all, there was just a desire and a need to avoid failure. At the time, I didn't really have the language to articulate what I was experiencing or even to recognize it at the time. I thought what I was feeling was just simple responsibility, just the normal experiences of leadership. But over time, I began to realize that much of my leadership energy was being fueled by insecurity. And the thing is, insecurity is very subtle. It doesn't really announce itself. It hides behind productivity. It disguises itself as diligence, and it often looks like excellence. So in those situations, what did I do? Well, I leaned into tactics. What do we do as leaders? We learn more principles. I relied heavily on conflict resolution frameworks, strategic planning sessions, organizational development models, performance metrics. Now, a lot of the books I read and seminars I went to did touch on personal development, but often it was framed more from a performance or an outcome-driven type mindset. You know, how to increase productivity, how to increase your influence, and how to optimize effectiveness. And, you know, while those insights were helpful, again, they still primarily focused on the external or the output. Now, they certainly helped me look composed, strategic, and disciplined, but very little prepared me for that deeper reality that the unexamined interior life that I was experiencing can quietly shape the entire institutional climate. And very little addressed the possibility that insecurity, fear, ego, or identity wounds could silently determine tone, culture, and relational safety. Internally, I had very little confidence in myself. What I didn't realize at the time, but I've come to learn, you know, over these last many years, is that my insecurity was shaping the culture more than any strategic initiative that I implemented. When I was anxious, my team could feel that tension. When I was defensive, a lot of times the meetings I led became very guarded. When I felt pressure, I unintentionally multiplied that pressure to those around me. And perhaps most painfully, I hurt a lot of people along the way. I didn't intend to do that, and I wasn't malicious in it. But because when a leader operates from insecurity, the people around that leader experience that insecurity. And sometimes that manifests as control. Sometimes it manifests as distance. Sometimes it manifests as intensity. There were moments when colleagues or team members would withdraw, and I'd interpret it as, you know, just their disengagement. But looking back, I now understand that it may have been a form of self-protection on their part because of what they were experiencing from me. And very little in my formal leadership training prepared me for the deeper reality that an unexamined interior life can quietly shape an entire institutional culture. And very little addressed the possibility that insecurity, fear, ego, or identity wounds could silently determine tone, culture, or relational safety. And it took years of reflection, feedback, and honestly, some painful self-awareness before I came to a conclusion that fundamentally changed how I think about leadership. Leaders do not multiply what they teach. They multiply what they carry. And that's the conclusion I came to over years and years of study and personal reflection. And the thing is, if that's true, then the most important leadership development work we will ever do is not strategic, it's personal. It's addressing that inner life. Over time, I began to ask even a harder question. If my internal insecurity could shape culture more than my strategy, what else inside a leader silently shapes the institution or the culture? Well, that led me to a conclusion that was both unsettling but very hopeful. Leadership is not primarily the transfer of information, it's the transfer of formation. That means the inner life of a leader is not just a matter of private inner work. It's an institutional force. So let me explain what I'm saying here. When we think about leadership development, we often focus on skill acquisition. You know, we want to refine our communications. We want to improve our strategic planning, study conflict management, or analyze systems and structures. And of course, all that matters, and all of that's really important. But beneath skill is something more fundamental. It's identity. Identity determines interpretation. Interpretation determines reaction, and reaction, repeated over time, becomes culture. Let me walk through that one more time. So identity determines interpretation. What I mean by that is how I view myself determines how I view the circumstances around me and how I interpret what's going on in those circumstances. Then that interpretation will determine how I respond or react to those circumstances. And my consistent reactions over time create a culture around me. The two leaders can walk into the same conflict meeting and create completely different outcomes, not because they've got different policies, but because they carry a different internal narrative. If a leader carries insecurity, a lot of times disagreement feels like a threat. If a leader carries ego, resistance feels like disrespect. If a leader carries fear, uncertainty can feel like danger. And once that interpretation is formed, reaction is it's automatic. It just happens. And then through that reaction, tone shifts, body language tightens, decisions tend to become defensive, control increases, listening decreases. I think we probably all experienced this to one degree or another in environments. And those reactions repeated over time become predictable. And predictable reactions become a normalized culture. So in academic life, we often speak about the hidden curriculum, sort of the unspoken norms and values that shape students beyond the syllabus. But perhaps the most powerful hidden curriculum in any institution is that emotional condition of its leader. There's a reason why management thinker Peter Drucker famously observed that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Strategy may set direction, but it's culture that determines experience. And culture is formed through repeated emotional patterns. You know, God knew this long before the field of organizational psychology. In Proverbs 4:23, the Bible says this: guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Now, that's just not just abstract spirituality. That's a leadership psychology. Everything flows from the inner condition. If a leader's heart is anxious, anxiety is going to flow. If a leader's heart is defensive, defensiveness is going to flow. But if the leader's heart is secure, stability will flow. And over time, what flows consistently becomes culture, which means leadership development that focuses only on external competence while ignoring internal formation is incomplete. We can refine policies, we can improve communication frameworks, we can restructure departments. But if identity remains unexamined, the culture will eventually revert to the emotional baseline of the leader. And this is why the inner life of a leader determines institutional impact. And it brings us to a practical question. If identity drives interpretation and interpretation drives reaction, how do we interrupt that cycle? How do we move from reactive leadership to transformative leadership? That's why I want to offer you a simple framework that's really reshaped how I lead. And it's one that I've been teaching for a while that I've seen the impact of over time. So let's talk about how do we interrupt this cycle. Again, if identity drives interpretation and interpretation drives reaction, We need to create a space for transformation in the midst of all that. Over time, I began using a simple framework that I now call the awareness triangle. It's not complicated, but it is powerful. So at the center of the triangle is identity. And surrounding identity are three forms of awareness that every leader, in my opinion, must cultivate: self-awareness, situational awareness, and spiritual awareness. So let's walk through each one of those. So first of all, self-awareness. Self-awareness asks a simple but often uncomfortable question. What is being activated, or what is going on inside me right now? What happens when tension rises in a meeting? When a colleague challenges a proposal or idea? When the financial numbers decline? When criticism surfaces? What's happening inside me? Am I feeling threatened? Am I feeling dismissed? Do I feel exposed? And more importantly, what identity story am I trying to protect? Am I trying to prove that I'm competent? Am I trying to maintain control of what's taking place? Am I trying to avoid looking weak? Without self-awareness, leaders react automatically. But with self-awareness, leaders pause. And it's in that pause where everything can change, because now we become aware of what's happening inside me. And now I can respond to that before I respond to what's happening outside of me. And speaking outside of me, that's where situational awareness comes in. So situational awareness asks this question: what is objectively happening here? Is it really a crisis? Or is the internal narrative, what's going on inside me, just amplifying the moment? So for example, resistance does not automatically equal institutional collapse. Dissatisfaction doesn't automatically equal leadership failure. But if insecurity is present internally, small challenges can feel like this huge issue that is threatening me personally. And situational awareness helps separate fact from fear. It allows the leader to respond proportionally rather than emotionally. And the third is spiritual awareness. Now, recognize that not everybody tonight may share the same faith background, but throughout history, spiritual awareness or spiritual traditions have emphasized the importance of, again, the interior examination. So spiritual awareness asks the question, what deeper formation might this moment be inviting? Is this an invitation to experiencing a little bit more humility? Is it an invitation to grow in my patience? Is it an invitation to express more leadership courage? In the book of Matthew in the Bible, chapter 12, verse 34, we find this statement: out of the abundance of the heart speaks the mouth. In leadership terms, that means what is abundant internally will surface externally. Spiritual awareness moves leadership from ego protection to character formation. So let me show you how all this works in a real scenario. Imagine a department meeting where a proposed change is met with resistance. Now, a reactive leader operating without awareness might interpret that resistance as disrespect. Their interpretation might be, they're challenging my authority. And the reaction may be defensive in their tone. Try and have a tighter control on what's happening, and they may be less open. But a leader practicing the awareness triangle hopefully will pause. And through self-awareness can recognize, hey, right now I'm feeling threatened. Through situational awareness, they may just recognize, are there legitimate concerns here? Not necessarily in, am I being threatened, but are there legitimate concerns in what's being presented, in the pushback, in the feedback, or the resistance? And then through spiritual awareness, recognize this may be an invitation for me as a leader to listen more deeply to those that I'm leading. Now, it's the same meeting, it's the same people, but the internal processes, the internal responses are different. And the institutional experience, the experience of those in that meeting, very, very different. Most leadership failures are not competency failures, they're identity failures. And the awareness triangle creates a disciplined way of interrupting the automatic cycle of identity, interpretation, and reaction. Now, it doesn't eliminate the pressure, unfortunately, but it does transform how pressure shapes culture. And over time, that changes everything. So if leaders really multiply what they carry, then cultivating this kind of awareness, it's really not optional. Actually, it's ethical. And let me explain what I mean by that. When we step into leadership, we're not only shaping systems, we're shaping people. Students are not just shaped by the content of our lectures, but by the emotional climate of our classrooms. Employees are shaped not just by the governing structures, but by the tone, the posture, and the relational safety. Institutions are shaped not just by policy, but by presence, which means the inner life of a leader is never private. It's always public in its consequences. If a leader carries anxiety, anxiety becomes normalized. If a leader carries ego, that ego becomes structural. And if a leader carries security, that security becomes a stabilizing force. Over time, what we carry becomes the baseline for what others experience. And this is why personal transformation is not merely self-improvement, it's stewardship. The Apostle Paul in the Bible in 2 Corinthians 3:18 speaks of being transformed from the inside out, from one degree of glory to another. Whether one approaches that text from a theological or psychological tone, the principle remains the same. Transformation is not behavior modification, it's inner reordering, it's inner transformation. And without that inner reordering, external reforms rarely last. And no doubt you've been in an organization or situations where a new policy or new procedure is brought in to fix climate issues, but the climate issues continue even if the policy is changed or the procedures are changed. Because again, without that inner reordering, that external reform rarely lasts. And many institutions do attempt those structural reforms without that personal reflection. Policies are rewritten. New structures are brought into the leadership organizational chart. New systems and evaluations are brought in. But if insecurity, fear, and ego remain unexamined in the leader, culture eventually bends back toward those external patterns. And that's why the most dangerous leader is not an immoral leader, it's the unexamined leader. Because the thing is, an immoral leader is often visible and can be seen as destructive, but the unexamined leader can carry unintentionally normalized pressure, silence, fear, ego, insecurity, all those things, while believing they're being responsible. And while the organization believes that they're being responsible. And thus the ethical question becomes this: am I willing to examine what I'm multiplying? Because whether we intend it or not, we are always multiplying something. In leadership, we often speak about intellectual courage, but emotional courage may be even more necessary. The courage to examine insecurity, the courage to admit our own limitations, the courage to invite feedback, and the courage to grow internally, not just professionally. When leaders commit to personal transformation, something remarkable happens. Trust increases, openness deepens, intellectual honesty becomes safer, and innovation becomes less threatening. Why? Because security at the top creates psychological safety below. The implications. And that is not soft leadership, it's sustainable leadership. So the question is no longer simply, how can I improve my strategy? The deeper question becomes, what am I carrying that others are already experiencing? With that in mind, I want to leave you with something very practical. It's not another framework to study, not another book to read, but a disciplined practice that can help you do some internal examination to see what you're carrying in order to know what you're multiplying. So I want to offer you a 30-day leadership challenge. For the next 30 days, I'm going to invite you not just to examine what you're doing as a leader, but examine what are you carrying? What is it on the inside that's cultivating culture on the outside? At the end of each week, set aside 15 or 20 minutes to ask yourself 4 questions. First question, where did I react instead of respond? So think back through some meetings, emails, difficult conversations. Where did my tone shift? Where did I become defensive? Where did I feel the need to control? Second, what fear or ego was operating in me at the moment? Was I trying to prove something? Was I trying to avoid looking weak? Was I protecting an image? Then third, what identity was I protecting? Was I protecting the identity of being competent, being respected, being right, or being indispensable? And fourth, what would a secure leader have done differently? Not a perfect leader, a secure leader. A leader grounded in an identity rather than insecurity. A leader able to listen without threat. A leader able to admit limitation without collapse. And write your answers down. And here's the thing, patterns are going to emerge as you do this inner work. And when patterns emerge, that's where transformation becomes possible. Because awareness is the doorway to change. And you don't need to announce this challenge publicly. You don't need to create a formal program. But if you're courageous enough, you might invite one trusted colleague to join you in this. Because leadership isolation often protects insecurity, but shared reflection often accelerates growth. Let me close with this. All of us are leaders, and your influence extends far beyond a classroom, meeting rooms, or offices. And here's the thing, people are going to forget your lectures or presentations. In about a week, you're probably going to forget 90% of what I said here today. But they're not going to forget the atmosphere you created. Other leaders may debate your decisions, but they will remember your posture. Institutions will revise strategic plans, but they will absorb your emotional baseline. Leaders do not multiply what they teach. They multiply what they carry. And the inner life of a leader determines institutional impact. So I'll leave you with one final question. What are you carrying right now that your institution is already multiplying? Stop share. And I will be dropping a link into the chat for the 30-day challenge. So I'll turn it back to you, Mr. John.
That was superb. Thank you, Mr. Brendan. I can't just get some words tonight to say how thankful we are for you to touch a very sensitive topic of the inner life of a leader. I could resonate with everything that you were saying here tonight. And like I mentioned to you earlier, I was also preparing on a module on working on the culture and how founders' mindset is going to be very critical. And so talk to me tonight. I'm sure a lot of people on the call will resonate with me in terms of how this is so very important in terms of building institutional culture. The few minutes that we have here tonight, I would probably open this up for some questions that anyone would have on the platform. So if you have a question, please raise your hand or unmute your mic and go ahead and ask Mr. Brendan the question that you have, or any observations or comments that you would like to offer. And please check the chat box. I think there is a 30-day challenge PDF that's really given there by Brendan. Okay, there seems to be a question here. When expectations of the team clash with expectations of the leader, how do we find a middle path?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of strategy books out there on conflict resolution and finding the right approach to conflict. One of the things that I encourage leaders to do, especially in situations like this, where you have either a single team member or multiple team members where you have conflict and there's a clash as far as maybe vision or a specific procedure for that task or whatever it may be, is in the middle of that, a lot of times what happens is the policy, procedure, strategy is really not the biggest area of conflict. What the biggest area of conflict is what is happening in me. Because when team members either challenge or question a direction or decision, I know for me, oftentimes I feel that gut check. There's something that happens in you in the midst of that challenge. And a lot of times what you're actually responding to is not the specifics of that challenge, that resistance, the policy. You're actually responding to the insecurity you're feeling inside. And I end up, instead of dealing with the actual situation, I end up trying to prove that I'm right or prove that the way I want to go is the best way, or I'm trying to overcome fear of feeling that I was wrong, or I look at, like a weak leader. So in any situation where there's conflict or there is a clash of ideas or direction, as a leader, the first thing I want to make sure that I'm doing is I'm not conflating that conflict with an inner conflict where I'm actually trying to respond out of an identity issue. I'm actually trying to solve the situation, because most situations are easily resolved. That's where situational awareness comes in the awareness triangle. And on that 30-day challenge, I have a copy of the awareness triangle on there. When you look at the situation in and of itself, usually those situations, those conflicts, are fairly easy to resolve. It's when they get conflated with all the stuff that's going on the inside. So if I, as a leader, can pause, recognize what's happening in me, where, okay, I want to make sure that I'm actually responding properly to the situation, not to what's happening in me. It makes it so much easier to work through those circumstances. Because what I've found is most people have align, let me use that word, align with the mission of the organization, and we have the same desire for the same outcome, but we may have a different path to get there. And it's the path that we're debating, not the outcome. And a lot of times what we do, again, we conflate the inner issue with the actual situation. So if I can separate those two, it's really easy a lot of times to work through the issue. It's just when I conflate it with that inner conflict, that's where it becomes very difficult, because now it's a personal issue. It's no longer an institutional or organizational issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's lovely. And one of the principles in conflict management is to separate the issue from the person, where very often we actually, bring the person in, and then it becomes an issue of ego getting involved, and it takes a different trajectory altogether.
Yeah.
But the ability to move the person out and focus on the issue, I think, calls for a lot of conflict maturity, and that doesn't come easy. So thank you for that. There was one more question. I see that Professor Patrick has raised his hand. Just before he asks the question, there's another question that says, how to get along with the team and often find fault with leader and disengage from the work? How to motivate to make the team, cooperate towards task completion?
Yeah, great question. So in there, finding fault with the leader and disengaging from the work, a lot of times I think what happens is the disengagement or the fault finding, again, tends to be a response to how the leader is expressing themselves, not so much the work itself. It is, how are they experiencing the leader and the culture that the leader is creating? And going back to where I said that leaders multiply what they carry, I think sometimes in leadership we rely heavily on the strategies, the skills, the policies, the procedures, thinking that those areas are, what's the word I'm looking for? I want to say sanitized, but that's really not the right word. That they are not affected. Let me put it that way. That they're not affected by what's going on inside me. That they in and of themselves are separate from my inner world, and thus we don't do a lot of inner world examination. Thinking if I could just have the right policies, right procedures, right strategies, then that takes care of everything. But that's not the case, because I know all of us have experienced, no doubt, in an organization where you've got great policies, great strategies, but the leader or leaders that are implementing those policies and strategies, we've got some serious issues with, just because of the climate that they create. So when you have a situation where teams are finding fault with a leader or they become disengaged with the work, a lot of times it's not that they don't line up with the mission or that they have an issue with the policies and procedures. That's it sometimes, but a lot of times, again, it's the personal, relational side when it comes to leadership. And what I encourage people to do, what I encourage leaders to do, first of all, is to be willing to ask yourself, how am I responding to this? Am I responding to somebody's disengagement or finding fault with me in the sense that I'm trying to defend myself, trying to prove that I'm right or I'm a good leader? Or am I willing to actually sit down and listen to what they're saying? And maybe there's something I'm doing inadvertently that is causing them to respond this way. And I don't even realize I'm doing it. Because I mentioned that there were many times in my past where I hurt people and I didn't even know I was doing it. I didn't even know I was responding to them or creating an environment where they felt they weren't safe. It was all because I was in a place where I had not done the inner work that I needed to do in order to create the culture where somebody felt safe to come to me and say, hey, look, you said this, or your emotional response in that meeting created this environment. But when we're in a position we can do that, then we can be intentional about creating those environments where it's safe for people to provide feedback for us in a positive, constructive way. Not obviously you're going to get your anomalies where people are just they just don't like you. It's just nothing you can do about that. But the vast majority of people I find that are on a team, they want to help bring about the mission. There may be disagreement about how to get there, but the biggest conflict, again, becomes relational. So it comes back to, how am I creating this environment? And am I being open enough to get the feedback or listen to what they're saying and to identify, is there anything legitimate in there of what they're saying? And can I make any changes in how I'm responding to them?
Thank you. All right, Professor Patrick, over to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving that wonderful opportunity to listen to this expert. The way he has combined the biblical knowledge with leadership is amazing. One question I have, Professor Brendan. We come from an academic kind of an atmosphere. What we find is that tenure of the leader is fixed. Let's say it goes by rotation for 3 years or 2 years. Now, as employees, we get adapted to somebody for a 3-year tenure. Another leader brings in another perspective. By the time we get adapted or acclimatized to him, there is a change happening again. So as you said, what the leader carries, I mean, by the time the followers or the institution follows, I think it creates a bit of pandemonium and confusion. So if you can throw light on that, Professor Brendan.
Sure, absolutely, yeah, and that's a great point, because there's times where you're not the senior leader or you're not the top leader, and you're within a culture that somebody else is creating that you have to adapt to. And again, that's another opportunity as leaders. When I was a police officer, I remember when I graduated the police academy, my very first training officer in the field, they called them field training officers. We spent 3.5 months with a training officer actually out on the street. And you would rotate from one training officer to another. So you had at least 3 different training officers. I remember one of the things my training officer, my first one, told me, he said, look, you're going to spend a whole month with me, and I'm going to teach you how I do the job of being a police officer. Next month, you're going to get somebody completely different. They're going to teach you their way of how to be a police officer. And there may be times where what they do is completely different than mine. As long as it doesn't violate the law. What he told me was, look, do it this guy's way or her way or my way. And when you get what they call cut loose, meaning on the field training, now you've seen a multitude of different ways of being a police officer. You get to choose, what did you like, what did you not like, and what resonates with you, what doesn't, and then you make the choice of how you want to lead. So a lot of times as we grow in leadership, we're thrown in multiple different environments. Some of them we like, some of them we don't. And sometimes there's leaders that I've learned more from in the sense of, I will never do that. I don't want to do that. And in a spiritual context, we talk about the spiritual awareness side. What I've discovered is sometimes the Lord has placed me in environments under leaders who create very negative cultures. And it's frustrating. But what I've discovered is it creates sort of this passion in me. And over the years, in those different negative environments, that passion got so deep within me that it provided a foundation of character development for me, that when the opportunity came to become the leader who sets the environment, I made sure that I was in a place to create an environment that was completely different than the negative ones that I was in. So again, sometimes you can't control the environment you're in. You're just on that place on the org chart where somebody sets the climate. But each environment can be a learning environment for you, for me, in deepening my own internal world, so that when the opportunity comes where I'm the one who sets the culture, I'm making sure that I'm setting it in a way that it is good for those that I lead, so they don't have the negative experiences that I had with others that I experienced along the way. So I always look at situations like that from more of the character development. What's going on inside me? How is this environment shaping me to become a better leader, if that makes sense?
Yeah. And also I think this is why values and framework of values in institutions and organizations become so very important. And when you hire leaders, you need to be hiring leaders who will walk by those values, who live by those values. Mm-hmm. When you compromise on that, then you're going to have big issues on culture and its bearings on the institution. All right, we'll probably have one final question. I see Professor Ranjita Dawn has two questions on the chat. Can identity narratives become barriers to effective leadership? Is question number one. Can strong organizational systems compensate for weak leadership self-awareness?
Great questions. So let me look at that first one. Can identity narratives become barriers to effective leadership? Absolutely. And I think there's a myriad of examples there. So when an identity narrative, especially one born out of insecurity, becomes the driver of the response of a leader, then it absolutely can be a huge barrier to effective leadership. Because now, I've been in organizations where people, where I and others I worked with were more concerned with how we can avoid setting off the leader because of their emotional responses, because of their insecurity, than we were focused on advancing the organization, advancing the mission. And the goal now was to make sure the leader was happy or felt secure or didn't feel challenged, rather than advancing the overall mission. So in other words, the focus became the leader rather than the mission. And that in that case, leadership effectiveness is completely eliminated because it's now all about the individual rather than the mission. So yeah, in that case, it definitely can affect the leadership effectiveness. And then, can strong organizational systems compensate for weak leadership self-awareness? To a degree, yes. As Mr. John was saying earlier, if you have a value system that is in place that can identify and sort of self-correct ineffective or insecure leaders, then yes. But that has to be consistent, because if you start making compromises because of this leader comes with a great pedigree, and you start compromising the value system of the organization just because of either the reputation or the profile of a leader, that communicates to everybody that the value system is secondary to the personality. And that's when everything starts breaking down from there. So yes, organizational systems can compensate for weak leadership self-awareness, as long as that weak leadership awareness is not tolerated because of an individual's position, platform, reputation over an extended period of time. What tends to happen is it's easier to tolerate the negative than it is to have courage to enforce the positive. And when that happens over time, again, that creates a culture in and of itself where, yes, we have a nice plaque on the wall that has our values, but in reality, we don't actually follow those. So yes, it can, but it has to be consistently cultivated, enforced, and allowed to do its job, if you will, over an extended period of time.
Thank you. And that's why most leadership training programs would have a component of self-awareness and understanding self in that curriculum. If you don't have understanding self in your leadership curriculum, you're starting on the wrong footing, and I see how important that is. So thank you so much, Mr. Brendan. This is just fabulous. Just simply love the model. This is so simple and straightforward, yet so powerful. Thank you for taking time this morning to being with us. We appreciate your inputs, and I'm sure people on the call would agree. I want to thank the people on the call as well. At one point of time, we did have close to 36 of them on the call. I think some of them have dropped off given the time. But I want to thank you once again, Mr. Brendan, for doing what you did, and hope to connect with you at some point of time later as well. And I thank everyone on the call as well being here tonight on leading, or rather learning, on the inner life of a leader. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you.
And thank you. And keep connecting and keep writing. We all know that we have the WhatsApp group still active. So do keep writing and chiming in. Take care and have a good night.